Hi there. Welcome back to my channel. It's been a long time. I'm very sorry. I missed all of you. I know. I disappeared and you were all afraid that I was dead. And the fact of the matter is that I was. I was dead inside. Look, the end of 2021 and the beginning of 2022, I believe, fully intended to kill me. It was the worst. I'm not going to get into it because none of you are here to just watch me sob through like an hour-long video, but it was rough. I made it through, and here I am, mostly alive. Maybe, probably. COVID for the entire family, all kinds of stuff. It was rough, but I'm here. I'm back to tell you the final installment of the Ken Rex McElroy story. So let's just jump right into it. If you are interested in true crime and you like sometimes inappropriate humor, go ahead and hit the subscribe button, and you can also give me a like if that's something that you want to do. So this is actually going to be the fourth and final installment of the Ken Rex McElroy story, and we spent the last three parts kind of delving into Ken's life, what had happened to him, and the things that he had made happen, and how he spent most of his life escaping any kind of accountability for any of his actions. And if you haven't seen parts 1 through 3, I'll link them in the description box, and you should probably watch them first because it's going to be really confusing. But if you don't want to, though, then you're a nonconformist, and I respect that. So when we left off, Ken Rex had shot two men. Otha, this was Alice's stepfather. Alice was his wife for all intents and purposes. And then also later, Romaine Henry, a farmer that Ken accosted coming home to his own farm in a Pontiac. The first shooting didn't even go to trial, with Ken fully frightening people out of testifying and pursuing any kind of charges. And the second shooting did go to trial, but after months of terrorizing the victim as well as any possible witnesses, Ken was acquitted. Ken also did unspeakable things to his partner of the time, 15-year-old Trina, who had just given birth to his latest child. Alice moved out of the house, and Trina and Ken married, which we've seen him do before, which prevented him from being prosecuted on all the terrible things that he had done to Trina. Everything in Ken's life story contributed to the ending of that story, but the events that we're going to talk about in this final video are the direct catalyst that began the countdown towards the end of Ken's life. We'll start this part in 1972. Lois and Ernest Bowenkamp bought a large white house on the outskirts of town where people coming to Skidmore followed the curve of the I-13 into town. 5 years later, they purchased the B&B grocery store in the center of town around the corner from the tavern. The grocery really wasn't a moneymaker, as most people in the area would do their big shopping trips in Maryville or St. Joe, but the couple had savings and Social Security that helped them live without too many worries. They enjoyed running the store and interacting with the people in the town. Bo was born in October of 1910, so he was a good 26 years older than his wife Lois, who was born in September of 1936. Lois had actually grown up in the Skidmore area. Bo was a gentle giant, standing at almost 6'5" and weighing around 220 pounds. He had blue eyes, and since he wore glasses, they were magnified by about 3 times, the old Coke bottle bottom glasses that my mom still rocks. Love you, Mama. Bo generally wore overalls and a short-sleeved plaid shirt with a baseball hat, and he was easygoing and the strong, silent type. He usually manned the meat counter of the store, and the customers appreciated his kind and courteous manner. Lois, on the other hand, was quite prickly, right? She was short, and what was described so short in short in stature, but also short in the way she spoke to people, and was described at the time as stocky, although today she may have been referred to as thick. She had dark brown hair and also wore glasses, but the eyes behind her glasses were shrewd and not given to whimsy of any kind. If she met someone who asked how she was doing, her usual response was, "Well, I'm here." Bo had 2 children from a previous marriage, and together with Lois, they raised 3. As mentioned, Bo mostly ran the meat counter at the store, and Lois was basically in charge of everything else. So the story has brought us to this point. We go to April 25th, 1980. Bo was behind the meat counter, as was his custom. Lois was sitting at a small table smoking and drinking coffee while she tended to the books. Their across-the-street neighbor and Lois's good friend, incidentally, Evelyn Sumi, was also employed as a clerk at their store, and that afternoon she had been working the checkout counter. It was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The bell for the front door rang as two girls came in, one a teenager with blonde hair and the other who looked to be about preschool age. As the older girl walked to the cookie aisle, the younger girl looked at the candy, and Evelyn wondered to herself, why wasn't this teen in school? After about 10 minutes, the teenage girl came to the counter with a candy bar, a sack of cookies, and asked Evelyn for a pack of cigarettes. Again, wild times. This girl was 15-year-old Debbie Ann McElroy, daughter of Sharon and Ken Rex, and she was buying cigarettes. It really was a wild time. Evelyn rang up the items before Debbie Ann handed her money, saying that it was for the candy bar and the cigarettes, making sure that Evelyn knew that she wanted the order to be split. So Evelyn voided out the order she had begun and began to ring them up again, separately this time. She noticed the small girl standing nearby and holding some gum and a jawbreaker, and asked Debbie about it. Debbie replied that the little girl had her own money. As Evelyn gave Debbie her change and the little girl didn't move towards the counter, Debbie turned to leave, and Evelyn asked about the candy once more. This really upset Debbie for some reason, as she whirled and she took the candy out of the child's hand and put it back on the candy rack, then tried to lead the little girl out of the store. This caused the child to turn into the banshee that all small children become when they don't get what they want, and she broke free of Debbie and ran back to the candy. Debbie, by this point, was opening the door to leave, and Evelyn called out so that she could be heard over the noise of the bell and the child wailing, "Ma'am, she still has the candy in her hand." This made Debbie even more upset, and she once more took the candy from the little girl, this time throwing it onto a box on the candy rack, and then dragging the wailing younger girl out of the door as the child continued to melt down. After they'd left, Evelyn hurried down the aisles to where Lois was sitting by the meat counter. She was very upset and had begun to explain the situation when the door opened again, and this time an older teenage girl came in. This one Evelyn Sumi recognized. It was Tammy McElroy, who had been in school with Evelyn's son and who'd come into the store several times. And she was not happy. When Evelyn asked, "May I help you?" Tammy angrily replied, "I want my money back." Evelyn was slightly confused, and when she asked for clarification, Tammy came closer and dropped the bag Evelyn had given Debbie with her things in it. Tammy then said, "Whoever here waited on my little sister accused her of trying to raid the store." Which, I wonder if that was more of a thing. Like, raid the store? That sounds pretty intense. It makes me feel like they had gathered up hordes of their Viking cohorts and they were making a raid on the store rather than just a little misunderstanding about a child wanting candy and not paying for it. I don't know. Maybe is it just me? Maybe that's me. Evelyn then tried to explain the situation to Tammy, but Tammy wouldn't even let her finish. "Debbie has no reason to lie to me." "Well, neither do I," Evelyn said calmly. And Lois decided that this was probably the time to make her appearance, wielding her authority as the boss of the establishment. She didn't recognize who Tammy was. Okay, so I feel like it's important at this point to read the actual conversation as quoted in the book by Henry MacLean. Lois: "Is there a problem here? I'm sure we can work it out." Tammy: "Nobody accuses my little sister of stealing." Lois: "What are you talking about?" Sharp, no-nonsense voice. Tammy: "Don't get snotty with me." Oh, the audacity of this child. Nope. You don't get to talk to an adult like that. Not today. Lois: "I'm not getting snotty with you. I just said if there's a mistake, we can straighten it out. If you'll just bring the girl back in, we can talk to her." At this point, Evelyn had completed the refund and gave the money back to Tammy as she began to reshell the items. Tammy: "She's only 4 years old. Nobody in our family will ever buy anything in this store again." And she started out the door. Lois, slightly huffy at this point: "Okay, fine. That's your privilege." Tammy flounced. The whole "bye, Felicia" kind of flouncing. And Evelyn burst into tears. She was pretty sensitive, and she'd never been accused of such a thing. It hurt her sensibilities to be accused of not only being rude, but being rude to children. And as they walked to the back of the store and Lois was kind of comforting Tammy, they talked about what had happened. Evelyn explained who the children were. Lois hadn't seen Ken in years, since she was a child, and wouldn't have even been able to pick him out of a crowd, while Bo had never met him at all. They both, however, had heard stories about him. His fame had preceded him. So now, Lois decided to go out to the sidewalk to see the younger girls, since she hadn't been up front when they'd come in, so she'd be able to recognize them if they ever did come back in. I assume so that she could toss them out, or just keep an eye on them, or maybe just, I don't know why exactly she wanted to know who they were. The three girls were in a green pickup truck parked just north of the store, and Lois looked at them and Tammy glared back. I can only imagine the sass coming from this teenager. After Lois had stepped back into the store a moment later, the three girls again came storming back into the store. Tammy, is there something else you want? Well, she glared with that way that only teenagers can. Lois evenly, no, I just wanted to see the other two girls, so if they come in here again, I will know them. Evelyn emerged from the back and, seeing the two original girls she had waited on, said, Debbie, you know I didn't accuse your little sister of raiding the store. Debbie, defiant as ever, said, yes, you did. And with that, the three girls bounced. Tammy and Debbie had smart mouths, and they had a lot of chutzpah for teenage girls. I am not going to lie, but I bet that would be easy to do if your dad could literally get away with anything. So, you probably felt protected to throw some sass around. About 20 minutes later, the bell above the door rang, and Evelyn saw a huge man coming down the aisle toward them. She told Lois, batten down the hatches, you're about to meet Ken McElroy. She stood. Bo came out from around the meat counter, and they walked to meet him. Ken held a large pocket knife with the blade open at about chest height, and Bo said, you can put that knife away. There's no need for that in here. Ken smiled slightly, which was a menacing sight, I'm sure, and said, nobody tells me what to do. Still with that, nobody tells me what to do crap. I mean, I guess it has worked well for him throughout his life, but still. The audacity and the entitlement, right? We hate an entitled king. Okay. He was almost chuckling, and he ran the blade along the tips of his fingers and said, I have a right to stand here and clean my fingernails, don't I? And just then a blonde woman burst out from behind Ken and began to screech a string of profanities, calling the women names and wanting to know which of them had accused her child of raiding the store. This was 1980 in small-town America. Lois and Evelyn were so taken aback by the vitriol spewing out of the woman that they were in almost a state of shock as the woman worked herself into more of a hysterical state, threatening and swearing at them. In a moment of sudden clarity, Evelyn recognized the woman as Trina McLeod, the shy and sweet little girl she had been. Only now, Trina was slurring her words slightly in a way Evelyn had never heard before and wondered if she was drunk. Let's be honest here. If I had to live with Ken Rex McElroy, I would probably be constantly drunk also. Just saying. So Evelyn said, if you'll just shut up for a minute, I can explain to you what happened, but you'll have to come up front to the register. Trina began hollering again, but McElroy, who had been quiet since he spoke to Bo, told her to be quiet, and she immediately stopped yelling so that she could let the women explain. Evelyn acted out the entire exchange as Trina and Ken watched. Trina seemed to pay attention and understand, asking at the end of Evelyn's explanation, but why would Debbie lie to me? She had no reason. I don't know. Maybe she's raised by a lying, murderous man of a father, and so that's just something that they do. I don't know. Could be way off base here. So Evelyn said, I don't know, Trina, I really don't know. Lois began to replace the roll of paper in the register, and Ken turned to her and asked for a package of Camels. Now Lois had pride, and she wasn't going to let this family kick her family around. She looked Ken right in the eye and said, Sir, I understand that nobody in your family wishes to do business in this store anymore. Ken said, that's right. And Lois said, so be it. Ken and Trina turned around and walked out saying nothing else. Lois felt uneasy about the interaction, though, and she felt sure that they had not heard the last of the McElroys, and she was right. The events that had transpired that day in the little small-town store had lit the wick on the powder keg of terror that had sat so heavily on the residents of Skidmore for so long. The confrontation with Evelyn and the Bowenkamps had officially started the timer, counting down what life Ken had left to live. And 15 months after that day in the store, Ken Rex McElroy would be dead. But that same day in April, Ken went around the afternoon after the incident to tell multiple versions of the story to various people in the town. One version was that Bo had thrown them out of the store, accusing them of stealing and calling all the McElroys thieves, which, let's be honest now, would not be a mischaracterization. He also said that his little girl had her allowance with her, but she put the jawbreaker in her mouth and Lois lost her crap, apparently. Debbie tried to pay for the candy and was very apologetic, but Lois told them to leave because she was super mean. So McElroy, like the saint that he was, had gone himself to the store to apologize and make things right. But Lois, in her unforgiving glory, tossed him as well. He also told Alice, his previous paramour and one of his baby mamas, that Evelyn Sumi had called him one night to tell him that he and Trina weren't raising their kids right. I mean, they weren't, but go off, I guess. Now at this time, there was a new sheriff in town, almost literally. The town had just voted in a new marshal, Marshal David Dunbar, who had run after making a bet over a keg of beer with a friend. That afternoon was also coincidentally the first time that David had ever had any kind of interaction with Ken. And that interaction went something like this. Ken, you're the new marshal. What would you do if my wife got in a fight with Lois Bowenkamp? I'm sorry, what? I just can't get over it. Like he wants his young wife, I don't know. Anyway. So Dunbar had been on the job less than 2 weeks, and he thought about the question as Ken spoke again. I just wanted to know what you'd do if something like that happened. Dunbar again thought and said, well, if both of them agreed to it, I'd referee the damn thing. If that's all it amounts to, it can't hurt too much. I mean, seriously. The audacity of this man, this grown man, wanted his 23-year-old wife to throw hands with 44-year-old Lois over something that his daughter had clearly lied about. I'm not even sure why I'm surprised, and yet here I am. It pains me. I'm tired. Seriously. Okay, so McElroy got back in his truck and drove to park back in front of the grocery store. And that night, the parade of terror began. Lois and Bo were home from the store and had just finished eating their dinner when they saw 3 trucks driving slowly past their house, about 10 feet apart, and each had a rifle or a shotgun in the back window gun rack. Ken drove the first truck, then Trina in the next truck, and Tammy in the final truck. After they'd driven past and reached the end of the block, they turned around and drove past again. This continued for some time as the Bowenkamps went about their normal business, but after a while, Lois couldn't take it anymore, and she stepped out onto the porch right as Trina drove by. Trina did a double take, and Lois thought to herself if they hadn't known exactly where she and Bo lived before, they sure did now. Lois went inside and immediately called Russ Johnson, who had recently lost the position of town marshal to David Dunbar, but was still a deputy sheriff for the county, and told him the whole story. Russ replied, now don't worry about it. He won't do nothing. Oh, he may harass you a little bit, but he won't do nothing serious. What about Ken Rex McElroy makes you think that he actually has some kind of limit in his behavior? He's already shot 2 men. He admits fully that he intended to kill them. I think Russ Johnson's faith was a little misplaced in this moment, but if there were ever more prophetic words, I couldn't write better foreshadowing. My goodness. Okay, so as I said, the candy incident happened on April 25th, 1980, which was a Friday. After he'd driven past their house, they didn't see or hear anything from Ken again until Tuesday, April 29th. Lois had noticed that Ken had parked his Buick in front of D&G's Tavern for most of the day. And when she left the store at closing time, 6 p.m., which, can you imagine, the only grocery store in town, closed at 6 p.m. I hope you didn't need to grab more cottage cheese for dinner because your husband ate it all as a snack the night before. That may or may not be a true story. I played the 5th. I love you, big guy. She left at closing time, 6 o'clock in the p.m., and she saw that not only was the Buick still there, but Ken was sitting in the driver's seat. He was clearly watching the front of the store. Lois attempted to walk haughtily to her station wagon parked nearby. I mean, as haughtily as you can walk to a station wagon, and got in the passenger seat to wait for Bo to lock up as Ken backed out of his spot and drove slowly toward her. As Bo was locking up, though, a woman came hurrying up and told him that she had desperate need of a ham for dinner. I can't count the number of times that I have had a ham emergency. You know, it happens all the time. So, Bo was a stand-up guy, and this was a small town, so he unlocked the door and went back inside so that she could get her emergency meat. Ken pulled the Buick up in the stall next to the Bowenkamp station wagon, and he put it in park. Lois stared straight ahead of her, but she could feel Ken's gaze burning a hole in the side of her face. He was staring at her. Not at all like a creeper. They sat like that for about 5 minutes until Bo and the older woman came back out with the wrapped ham. And I know it doesn't seem like 5 minutes is a long time, but it is an eternity when a crazy Elvis impersonator is staring directly at you. Bo came over to the station wagon and started to open the driver's door. But Ken spoke to him in a low and menacing voice. Hey, is she still the boss in this store? Bo said, well, yeah, she is. Dang straight, of course she is. Ken said, is she the boss on the street? Bo didn't even answer him, which go Bo. He just got in the station wagon and shut his door. Lois, though, jumped out of the car and marched her sassy little self over to the passenger side of Ken's Buick. So Lois said, Mr. McElroy, as far as I know, there is no boss on the streets, which must have infuriated Ken because he clearly considered himself the boss of the streets, but I digress. Ken said, yeah? Well, you accused my kids of raiding your store, didn't you? Lois said, no. Nobody ever accused your kids of stealing in my store. They had a stare down with a glare down. But then Lois softened some. She told Ken that she and he were actually somewhat related. Lois's mother was a sister to Russ Johnson, who was, as we know, the deputy, but also Trina's uncle, as well as to Sue McNeely, Trina's step-grandmother. This did not impress Ken, however, and he told Lois in no uncertain terms that he didn't care who she was related to, and just what he thought of Russ Johnson. I am not going to read the quote verbatim because I would like to keep this channel as family-friendly as crime channels can be. But he said something along the lines of that Russ was a coward and that Ken could whoop him with both hands behind his back. And he announced that Russ was the biggest poultry excrement in town. So there's that. He calmed himself down, though, and told Lois, quote, I'll tell you what, I'll give you $100 bill if you'll try and whip my old lady's ass right here on the street, end quote. Lois, what purpose would that serve? Ken actually grabbed his wallet and pulled out a C-note to then wave in Lois's face, which she did not appreciate. It's yours if you'll do it. All you got to do is try to whip my old lady's ass. You just wait right here while I'll go... I'm good at talking. Really one of my top 5 skills. It's yours if you'll do it. All you got to do is whip my old lady's ass. You just wait right here while I go get her. End quote. Lois didn't want his money and told him that she was not going to fight with Trina in the middle of the street because it's not Friday, and on Friday is when we do street fights, but on Wednesdays we wear pink, and on Fridays is when we street fight. This was a Monday. What was he thinking? The man had no sense of propriety. So Ken then told her that she shouldn't worry. He'd pay the fine, which when she asked what fine, he just kept repeating that he would pay it. She asked what he was talking about, and he just kept saying, I'll pay the fine, which fine, you'll pay the fine. That's great, but what are you even talking about? I feel like I'm taking crazy pills. Lois had had a gutful. She was done with Ken and his nonsense, so she screamed the only thing that she could think of to sum up the situation, right in Ken Rex McElroy's face. Quote, bullshit, end quote. She may have been prickly and a little mean, but we stan a self-confident queen. Love that for her. Then she immersed herself back to the station wagon, got in and, of course, slammed the door behind her, and Bo placidly drove them home. As soon as they got home, though, Lois marched right across the street to tell Evelyn what had happened. Just as she was telling her about the $100 bill waving incident, Evelyn gasped and pointed that Ken had just parked his Buick south of her driveway. Not only that, but the green Dodge with the white camper top was parked on the other side of their drive, and both vehicles were empty. Lois immediately thought of Bo, who was alone in the house, but before she could move, she saw Ken and Trina walking down the street from the north. As they passed the Bowenkamp's house, they slowed down and almost swaggered as they looked from left to right, like they were daring anyone to say anything to them. And it was at that moment that Lois realized that she might have gotten in over her head with the McElroys. So she used Evelyn's phone to call for backup, then hurried across the street into her own house. A few minutes later, her parents pulled up, parked, and went inside. The 4 of them watched from the kitchen table as Ken opened the hood of the Dodge and he began looking at the engine, right? Lois called the highway patrol, and a few minutes later, Ken and Trina drove away. Ken had sophisticated radio equipment in his vehicles, if you remember, including a police scanner. So the police even knew this, yet they continued to broadcast all of their plans regarding Ken Rex McElroy, which gave him, of course, plenty of warning. Sure enough, about 20 minutes later, Russ Johnson, Lois's uncle, and the biggest poultry excrement in town, drove up. And he showed up with Trooper Cash, and Lois explained the situation and demanded that something finally be done. But unsurprisingly, they said that he wasn't breaking any laws and there was nothing they could do. I might agree with the poultry excrement thing. Just saying. Russ then told Lois that he would cruise around the streets for a minute and then write up a report later. And there's no way of saying whether he actually did do a cruise, but what we do know for sure is that there was never a written report submitted. About an hour after that, Ken and Trina showed up, this time together in a green Dodge. They parked in the same spot because they were evidently having car trouble again, which they just have the worst luck with cars, and it just always happens to happen right outside of their victims' houses, which, I mean, can you believe their luck? It's just crazy. So about 45 minutes later, before nightfall, they left. For whatever reason, Ken had decided to place all the blame on the grocery store incident squarely on the heads of the Bowen camps, instead of Evelyn, the actual clerk who had actually had the interaction. He seemed to think that tormenting Bo was good fun, and he laughed heartily about the idea of terrorizing the old man. He did not laugh, however, about Lois. It seemed that he had finally come across a woman who did not cow to his every move, and that made his blood boil. He would call her a witch with a B and blame everything on her, saying, "How could a woman be the boss of a man? How could a man let a woman be the boss?" Oh, man. Ken and I would so not get along. I'll tell you that. He was genuinely perplexed and perturbed that Lois had stood up to him. He felt it was his duty to teach her her place, which in his misogynistic mind was firmly below men. I think we all know somebody like that, even today in 2022. So, it's unfortunate. The Bowen camp's daughter, Cheryl Brown, was ultimately pulled into the situation as well. She was driving home from visiting her parents when she noticed a green Dodge truck following about 10 yards behind her, regardless of her speed. When she turned into her drive, the Dodge slowed down so much it nearly stopped. When she got into her house, it was gone. And, just like with Romaine's case, Ken would let time go by between his little visits. It was almost a month before he showed back up again at the Bowen camps, in the green Dodge with Trina in the passenger seat, guns in the gun rack, and a hound dog in the back. Bo and Lois were out in their front yard pulling weeds, and after a momentary stare-off between Ken and Lois, Ken got out of the truck, put on gloves, popped the hood, trying to fix the seemingly ever-broken truck. Trina stayed in the truck and didn't take her eyes off the Bowen camps. Lois and Bo decided to ignore them and hope they went away. They didn't. So Bo and Lois finished their chores, and they stayed on the porch outside their kitchen until it was almost nightfall. When they finally went inside, Ken went around to the bed of his truck and said something to his dog, then thumped the side, and the dog started barking and howling. He waited for it to stop, and then repeated his action and got it going again. He did this 3 or 4 times before he finally got back in the truck and drove away. The Bowen camps breathed easier, thinking that it was over for the night, but it wasn't. Ken was back 45 minutes later in the green truck, driving slowly until he reached the Bowen camp's driveway. And this crazy, insane man got out of his truck and started firing his shotgun in the air. Seriously, I don't know what people think happens to bullets when they're fired in the air. Do you think they dissolve? Isaac Newton figured it out in 1687 with an apple. But even today, in the year of our Lord, 2022, people still don't think it's dangerous to shoot guns into the air. The bullet has to come down, and in this case, the shot has to come down somewhere. Sigh. Anyway, after a few minutes, he got back in the Dodge, and as they drove away, Lois got a clear view of Trina in the passenger seat. 30 minutes later, they came back, and Ken fired once again, but it seemed closer and louder. And then after a few minutes, they again left. This was the incident that made Skidmore realize over the next couple of days that because of the candy incident, someone might actually get hurt. Because him shooting Romaine Henry on his own land for no gosh dang reason wasn't enough of a wake-up call, I guess. I suppose it was because Romaine's shooting had happened in the country on an isolated farm, whereas the Bowen camps lived in town, so they might not be Ken's only victims during this situation. The Bowen camp's annoyance had changed into genuine fear. Lois didn't dare call the police because she knew that Ken was monitoring all the police bands. But she and Evelyn did drive into the sheriff's office in Maryville to report the shooting the day after it happened. Sheriff Roger Kronk did exactly nothing except tell the women to watch Ken. There were witnesses to the shooting, but the police acted like their hands were tied, impossible, nothing they could do. They were well and truly terrified of Ken. Ken had free rein. He showed up again and again, shooting into the air. And after leaving, then coming back in the middle of the night, this time the shotgun was accompanied by the sound of cracking wood and flying splinters. It seemed that this time Ken had actually upped the ante. He fired twice more and then left for the night. In the morning, Lois found a tree in her yard, peppered with shotgun pellets. She had never owned a gun, but she went and bought a 20 gauge and learned how to use it. Which I think is actually done too late, but anyway, I digress. Rather than waste her time with the sheriff's department, Lois tried David Dunbar, the man who had been marshal for 6 weeks and who offered to referee the fight between Trina and Lois as long as everyone was agreed it was what they wanted to do. Clearly, he had wonderful judgment. So, Lois found that Russ Johnson had told Dunbar nothing about the Bowenkamp's issues with Ken, telling David only to watch him because he was rough. Understatement of the year. Lois explained what had been going on and told Dunbar that they were counting on him. This man had no police background or experience. He'd hunted and he'd shot, but that was it. Lois told him that they had no other choice and they'd have to depend on him. He replied that he would do his job. He knew what the townspeople said about Russ Johnson and his obvious fear of Ken, and he did not want to be painted with the same yellow brush. In late June, Dunbar saw Ken parked in front of the Bowenkamp's house, and he approached him to ask him what he was doing. Ken told him in a friendly voice that he was just sitting there. Dunbar: "Have you been shooting your shotgun near the house?" Ken, with a grin: "Could be, but you know we're getting real close to the 4th of July. Maybe it could have been fireworks." So all Dunbar could do was shake his head and drive off. The next evening, while David Dunbar was in his front yard playing with his kids, the 3 McElroy pickups caravanned slowly past. They circled once, then they left. Dunbar realized that what everyone had said was true. If you try to help someone that Ken has his sights on, you'll be the next one in his crosshairs. He was sympathetic for the Bowenkamps and angry with the town. Why had they let Ken get away with this for so long? Because even though the town was worried about the shootings and talked about it constantly, they did nothing to help the Bowenkamps. No one called. No one offered to help keep watch. No one did anything. Sometimes a really close friend would call to tell them that they'd seen Ken in town, but that was it. They even stopped shopping at B&B Grocery, and sales dipped. Lois had grown up there, but she hadn't moved back with Bo until 1972, so the tiny town considered them outsiders to some degree. And people thought that Lois might be getting a little taste of her own medicine, since she wasn't considered the most approachable person. After all, she had refused to sell cigarettes to Ken Rex. She was asking for this. I hate it. I hate it. I hate the victim blaming. I hate she was asking for it. That is the worst explanation for one person hurting another person that I have ever heard. So the townspeople tried to ignore what Ken was doing, but the fear in the air of the town was tangible. Not all of the residents had actually met Ken, but they'd heard the stories and they knew who he was. They were terrified because you could do something to offend Ken without even knowing, and then you'd be on his list. Similarly, law enforcement in the area didn't do anything to Ken. It was clear to the town and the Bowenkamps that they stood alone. In July of 1980, Bo turned 70. The air conditioner wall unit had broken down in the grocery store, so Bo called the electrician, who wouldn't be able to come until that evening. Ken spent most of that afternoon drinking beer in the tavern. Red Smith was the bartender, and his way was to stay out of everyone else's way and mind his own business.
It's none of my business. It's none of my business.
Red thought that Ken had seemed fairly amiable that afternoon. 4 teenage boys were kind of loitering outside the tavern, leaning on various cars, and they watched as Ken left the tavern, got into his green truck, and moved to the other side of the street, where he had a clear view of the grocery. Bo saw Ken sitting in the truck, staring at him, while Bo waited for the electrician. Bo decided to cut up some cardboard boxes with an older butcher knife while he waited. As he did, he saw the green truck leave, and Bo thought it was for the night. Ken was done with his terrorizing. His shift was over. He was clocking out of his job of terrorizing people, I guess. But Ken just circled around, then drove right up alongside the loading dock, opening his door and getting out. Ken asked Bo if he had called the police. And Bo said, quote, "No, I haven't. I don't have no reason to call the police," which I wonder if Ken knew that was a double negative, and so then he felt slightly threatened. It's possible. We knew that he was mostly illiterate, but we don't know his grasp on syntax. Food for thought. So then Ken asked, "Are you mad at me?" And this kind of supports my idea of arrested development, because Ken sounds like a child asking his parent that after the child has been reprimanded for doing something they weren't supposed to do, right? Continually asking if the parent is mad at them because they can't separate the parent actually providing correction for behavior and the parent personally being angry at them. Bo, to his credit, answered, "No, I'm not mad at you," which I would not have answered that. But that's neither here nor there. I have no lines in this play. This is not my story. I'm just telling it. So this might have signaled the end of the interaction, the end of the McElroy siege, in fact. But as Bo looked at Ken and he remembered all the terrorism he had submitted them to, something deep inside Bo flared. And this was rare. He was tired. He was tired of this man tormenting them. So he looked Ken square in the eye and said, "This is private property, you know, and we want you off it." And you remember Ken's little hang-up about people telling him what to do? So Ken replied, "Nobody tells me what to do." Okay. So with that, he walked away from Bo and he left his truck there and walked over in front of the tavern where the four boys were still loitering, and then he gave them a $5 bill telling them to go inside the tavern and get something to drink, which I have to imagine that he meant something like a soda or something. However, this is the same town and the same time that they let like the 15-year-old Debbie Ann buy cigarettes, you know. So I don't know what he meant for them to drink. I'm just going to pretend that he's like, "Hey, go in there and get a root beer. It's going to be a good day." You know, it's how I sleep at night. So the boys walked inside the tavern, and Ken again walked back to the loading dock where he'd left his truck. Bo looked up from cutting up the cardboard boxes, and he saw himself staring down the business end of Ken's famous shotgun. For a tense minute, Bo wondered if Ken was just bluffing. He sensed the answer, though, and he jerked his body to the right just in time as he heard the boom of the shotgun and felt an incredible pain in his neck, and he collapsed to the ground. Shotgun blasts are loud. That is a thing that is true. So inside the tavern, they also heard the blast. One of the owners, Greg, the G of D&G Tavern, yelled at Red to lock the door so Ken couldn't come in the back. It was spookily quiet for several minutes until one of the teen boys, named Steve Day, unlocked the door and looked around. He saw one of the doors on the loading dock moving, and when he went to check on it, he saw Bo lying partially inside the door, blood streaming out of two enormous holes on his neck. Steve knelt by him, and Bo whispered, "Get help." Steve ran back to the tavern, and he pounded on the now locked again door, yelling for them to open it. Steve said, "The old man's been shot." So Greg called an ambulance, and Steve went out with one of his friends, John, to go find the marshal. They found David Dunbar at the liquor store and told him the whole story. Dunbar got in his car, checked the glove box for his pistol, and drove to the grocery. One of the men who had been with David at the liquor store took one of his t-shirts off to put pressure on Bo's neck. Bo was still able to mumble something, but all he said was, "I'm dying. I know I'm dying." Can you imagine the terror? All you are doing, all you've ever done, is minding your own business. He was cutting up cardboard boxes. He may have been trying to recycle them. That is a good thing to do for the planet. And yet he was shot for it. It's not fair. Meanwhile, Lois and her friend and employee, Evelyn Sumi, were sitting on the Bowen Camp's porch drinking coffee when Evelyn called her husband Ronnie to tell him they were going to move to a different porch, chasing the shade and the cooler air. Ronnie listened to the police scanner, and he'd heard that an ambulance and police had been called to the grocery store. And when he inquired and Lois told him that Bo was still down there, he told her to get up there. Bo had been shot. When Lois and Evelyn got there, and Lois demanded to know what had happened from Russ Johnson, she was told that Bo had indeed been shot. She said bitterly to Russ, if the law had done its job, this wouldn't have happened, and she wasn't wrong. The men who were rendering aid to Bo told Lois that he'd been asking for her, saying Loie, Loie, over and over. But Lois understood what he was actually saying, and that was McElroy, McElroy. He was telling the crowd the name of the man who had attempted to kill him. Bo was rushed to the hospital, and he reached the ER at about 9:30 that night, where he was surprisingly still conscious. and still able to answer questions about what had happened to him. His vitals were even stable. This was this man's 70th birthday. They just don't make them tough like that anymore. So he was then rushed into emergency surgery, as you would imagine. The wounds were cleaned and the bleeding points tied off. And then Bo was given a unit of blood. Doctors were amazed that Bo was still alive. As am I. As soon as Bo was out of surgery and moved to the intensive care unit, Sergeant Danny Estes, Deputy Russ Johnson, and 2 others went to question the old man on his birthday again. His 70th birthday. He was clearly traumatized, but he was clear and rational, and he knew who had tried to kill him again. He told them it was Ken Rex McElroy. That same evening, July 8th, Corporal Richard Dean Stratton was directing traffic for highway repair crews, and to try to alleviate the boredom, he was surfing the other police channels when he flipped to the Nottoway County Sheriff's frequency in time to hear the words shotgun, Skidmore, and grocer, and he knew exactly what had happened. Stratton knew that Ken had finally shot Bo. It was showtime. Stratton realized, though, that he didn't have enough fuel for an extended car chase, so he headed back to headquarters, and he didn't even bother to call in. He was pumping gas when the dispatcher called desperately over the radio for him. As the dispatcher gave him the information, Stratton was formulating a plan. He had to cut Ken off between there and the Missouri River. He couldn't let him cross into another state. In the years since Stratton's first run-in with Ken Rex McElroy, Stratton's reputation had grown as well. A reputation of being kind, compassionate, good-natured, going out of his way to help the people he served. He only became unpleasant when he knew someone was trying to pull one over on him. He was considered tough but fair, a cop with nothing to prove. Stratton knew that Ken was going to try to jump the Missouri River into Kansas to buy time for the situation to either cool down or for his lawyer to buy him enough time to get rid of any evidence and arrange alibis. Because Stratton had made it his business to know Ken better than he knew himself, he knew which roads Ken was likely to take in his escape. So he headed down one of the directions that he thought Ken would take. He didn't radio for blockades or backup because he knew. He was smart. He knew that Ken would be monitoring the frequencies. And sure enough, as he entered the center of town in Fillmore, a green Chevy pulled up and stopped at the stoplight in the opposite direction. It was Ken, with Trina in the passenger seat. Ken's jaw dropped when he saw Stratton. Naturally, a chase ensued. Stratton finally used his radio to call the dispatcher with a description of the truck and their location. Ken tried to pull onto gravel roads, trying to lead Stratton into the bush so that other cars wouldn't be able to find him and offer backup. Stratton knew that he had to take Ken right then, alone. So with his lights on and his siren blazing, Stratton forced Ken to pull over. He shone his spotlight into the rear window of the truck and to blind them of his position, and he slid out of his car with his riot gun, a sawed-off Remington Wingmaster 12-gauge pump shotgun, loaded with buckshot, and he crouched behind his door. "Ken McElroy," Stratton said in a commanding voice, "open the door and step outside." Stratton managed to get Ken out of the truck and handcuffed, and then he did the same to Trina. He settled them at the back of the truck, one on the left tail light and one on the right. Ken complained that the cuffs were too tight. Stratton said, "You'll live." Then he got on the radio and let the rest know that the scene was secure. Ken and Trina both claimed ignorance about Bo's shooting, with Trina saying adamantly that Ken had been home with her the entire time. Backup soon came, and word spread fast. Richard Dean Stratton had chased Ken and Trina down and taken them in single-handedly. There was nothing to hold Trina on, so she was released, and Ken, true to form, bonded out. Bo Bowenkamp eventually recovered and was released from the hospital, only for Ken and his little gang of domestic terrorists to start up all of their intimidation again. And they were attempting, this time, to scare the Bowenkamps out of testifying. A preliminary hearing was held in August, and Bo Bowenkamp sat on the front row to bear witness against Ken McElroy. Naturally, Ken's lawyer McFadden began to employ every trick he knew to push the date of the trial and buy Ken more time. He filed a motion for change of venue based on the obvious hatred of the McElroys in the area, and it was granted, so it was moved to Bethany, about 80 miles away. These tactics continued throughout the fall and winter of 1980, and the spring of 1981. The Bowenkamps were crumbling under the pressure, as you can only imagine, expecting Ken to pop up and kill them all at any given moment. Finally, June 25th, 1981 rolled around, the date of the trial. The witnesses testified, the evidence was heard, and the jury retired. Even though Ken had tried to tamper with a member of the jury by bribing him to hang the jury, the verdict came back and pronounced Ken guilty of second-degree assault and a 2-year sentence. Ken Rex McElroy was finally going to prison. Except Missouri law allowed the defendant 25 days to file for a new trial, and Ken was allowed to remain on bail until the judge made their findings on the new motion. So, though the verdict was guilty and the proposed sentence extraordinarily light considering what he had done, Ken was free. The judge had told Ken he was going to prison and then sent him right back to the town full of people who had helped convict him. Ken was desperate. He was desperate to find a way out of going to prison, and he also became more and more paranoid. The walls were closing in, and Ken and Trina were certain that someone was going to murder Ken at any moment, which, I mean, they kind of deserved that paranoia a little bit after all the times that they'd inflicted the same fear on other people. But, eye for an eye. The town of Skidmore had reached a tipping point where they had kind of kept to themselves when the Bowen camps were fighting Ken. It now seemed that it was Ken versus the whole of Skidmore. On June 30th, Ken drove into town, and since Ken was prohibited from carrying a weapon, Trina had an Army MI rifle in the gun rack of her truck. Ken immediately struck up a conversation with Pete Ward, a Skidmore native and grizzled former Army officer. Ken told Pete that he had a gun he wanted to show him, and Trina obediently got up and went to retrieve the MI. Ken started waving the gun around and even slammed a clip into it and jacked a shell into the chamber. While Ken was waving the gun around, he began to describe how he was going to use it to shoot Bo in the face, and then use the bayonet attached to fillet him. Pete Ward had had enough. He was tired of Ken terrorizing the town, and he was going to put a stop to it. So he looked Ken right in the eye and said, quote, "Like hell you will," end quote, which, go off, King. We love that. How many times have I said that in this video? I don't know. I feel like I've said king and queens and whatnot like 3 times. I guess we know what phrases are stuck in my head at the moment. We'll record it for posterity. So, he and his sons stormed out of the tavern. He walked quickly to his house and reemerged a minute later with his rifle and proceeded to walk until he was at the corner in front of the gas station. If Ken was going to get Bo, he'd have to go through Pete first. He had jacked a shell into the chamber and the safety was off. Quote, "If that son of a bee comes up this way with that rifle, I'm going to blow him away," end quote, which it's about stinking time that somebody besides the Bone Camps stood up to Ken Rex McElroy. So, like a true bully, when confronted with someone who was actually willing to do something about it, Ken and Trina quickly left the tavern quietly, got in their respective trucks, and left. But this action by Pete Ward was the match that lit the powder keg of stress and terror the town had lived under for years. Word about Pete standing up to Ken spread like wildfire, and the town took it as permission to stop being afraid and to start fighting back. Even though they had been failed by it previously, many times before, Pete turned to the law and reported Ken for violating his bond by carrying a weapon, and that he threatened to kill a witness, that being Bowenkamp. The prosecutor filed a motion seeking to revoke Ken's bond. Ken's paranoia grew. July 5th, 1981. Ken confronted Pete and asked if he'd signed the affidavit against him, and without July 5th, 1981, Ken confronted Pete and asked if he'd signed the affidavit against him. Without skipping a beat, Pete told him he had. When McElroy demanded to know who else had signed, Pete refused to talk. Ken tried desperately to regain the power and terror he'd once wielded, but the town was done being afraid. Ken tried his usual terrorizing tactics, but the town wasn't having it. All the men began to openly carry weapons of their own, and Ken realized that he couldn't possibly win as one family against an entire town. Friday, July 10th, 1981. The town had created a plan to drive to Bethany in support of Pete and the others who had signed the affidavits against Ken to make sure nothing happened to them. But McFadden had been pulling strings behind the scenes and had managed to secure a continuance, pushing the hearing until the 20th. and Ken wouldn't live to see it. The town gathered at about 6:30 a.m. with pickups parked up and down the sides of Main Street. Many hadn't heard about the continuance, but when they began to gather, the word spread. Some of the men thought it was a bust, so they might as well go back and do their work and not worry about it until the 20th. But the majority thought they ought to have a meeting to see what else could be done to protect the 4 men who had signed the affidavit until then. When people meet together, especially over a tense topic, things can escalate fairly quickly. You have that mob mentality kind of thing. So as the men gathered to discuss the fact that it had been put off yet again that Ken was still walking free, they began to get more and more riled up. And they talked about possibly creating a town posse to patrol and keep the McElroys in line. So Sheriff Danny Estes was actually in attendance there at the very beginning of the meeting, and he pleaded with the townspeople to calm down and to not turn to violence, which, that's rich, right? Like, the police had not protected them in any shape or form against the violence that Ken Rex McElroy had perpetrated. So it's awfully rich to tell them not to turn to violence. That's just my particular opinion. So after he pleaded with this mob that was clearly growing more and more angry, he left. Yes, the sheriff, Danny Estes, who incidentally had a twin brother named Lanny. Like in real life, they were Danny and Lanny. Outstanding. The sheriff left an angry mob in the midst of their angry mobbing and thought it was a good idea. He thought that was a good idea. This is good. Angry mobs always calm down by themselves. They are definitely not going to murder anyone. I imagine that's what he was saying in his mind as he climbed into his car and drove out of Skidmore, but he was wrong. Dead wrong. I'm sorry, I had to. I'll see myself out. Anyway, Ken's sister Dorothy ended up finding out about the meeting and immediately drove to Ken's to let him know. Ken called McFadden, but he wasn't in yet. So Ken decided that the super smartest thing to do would be to drive right into the middle of an angry mob that's dedicated entirely to him. Genius. I don't know why he didn't pursue higher education. He took Trina with him, and when they got there, they went into the tavern. Trina tried to talk him out of it, but he was determined. Maybe he thought he could intimidate everyone out of action like he had in the past. Maybe he was tired of being paranoid and afraid. Imagine that. And he actually had a death wish. We'll never actually know. What we do know... Oh, geez. My dog just scratched on the door and scared me because I'm a scaredy cat. The dog wants to be where I am. I don't blame him. I'm amazing. What we do know is that someone came into the town hall and told all the men that Ken McElroy was presently in the tavern at that very moment and suggested that they all casually go for a beer. The noise in the town hall died abruptly. This was a defining moment. This was a sliding doors moment. Every man there knew that if they didn't go right down to that tavern, none of them would ever be able to look into any of the others' eyes again. It was a little after 10 a.m. when Ken and Trina entered the tavern, and minutes later, one of the owners, Del Clements, came in and told Red he better get ready because a bunch of men were coming in for drinks. The group, or mob rather, whichever you like, entered the tavern in 2s and 3s until the place was filled. The crowd made small talk, and after a tense time, Ken finally threw a $5 bill on the counter to pay for him and Trina and stood up to leave. Trina could sense the shift in the attitudes and the power in the town, the change from fear to anger, and she was frightened. She and Ken no longer had the upper hand. As he and Trina made their way to the truck, the group followed them, and when Ken reached for the door, men began to shout at him to get out of town and to not come back. Ken didn't react, except to just get in the driver's side of his Silverado. Sometime between when word came that Ken was in town and the moment he and Trina left, 3 men had broken off from the crowd to have their own discussion and decided on their own course of action. The terror in the town couldn't be allowed to continue. It was time to kill or be killed, and they chose the first option. With Ken and Trina sitting side by side in the pickup surrounded by an angry mob, most of the townfolk didn't move. They sensed the tension and sense of anticipation in the air. There was some movement, however, and it only took Trina a fraction of a second to realize what it was. It was a man in the crowd, and he was raising a rifle. The back windshield of the truck shattered. Ken's head snapped forward, and Trina screamed. Ken had a hole in his cheek. Another shot sounded, and Ken was hit another time. A man from the crowd came forward and jerked Trina's door open, ripping her out of the truck and yelling, "Get down or they'll shoot you too." Another man grabbed her and dragged her up the street toward the bank as she screamed for people to please stop shooting Ken. It always amazes me when you get people who are unapologetically violent. You get serial killers whose victims get the upper hand on them and then they're begging for their life. It astounds me that they would not have spared those people if the roles were reversed, and yet they have the unmitigated audacity to beg for mercy. It just, I don't know. The nature of humans, the nature of people will never stop surprising me. Later, witnesses would estimate that the shooting had lasted about 10 to 20 seconds. And it doesn't sound like a lot, but set a timer and hold your breath for 20 seconds. And imagine that bullets are flying at you during that time. It's an eternity. When the shots ceased, the town was quiet, except for the sound of a revving engine. Ken Rex McElroy was sitting in the driver's seat of his pickup truck. His neck slumped down onto his chest like he may have just fallen asleep in church. Half of his face was missing, though, and blood was spattered everywhere. When his body had gone limp, his heavy foot, in his heavy boots, had fallen on the gas pedal, flooring it. The big truck engine was roaring at maximum RPMs. Someone in the town said, "Better shut it off." And someone else replied, quote, "To hell with it. Let it burn," end quote. And then the entire town just dipped. And the only sound in the town was the roaring of the truck until the engine started to break down from the strain. Then, with the horrible shriek of metal tearing, the engine blew, and silence covered the town. Jack Clement towed a hysterical Trina into the bank and said to the cashiers there, quote, "This is Trina. She hasn't been hit. Take care of her," end quote. Trina was splattered in blood and gore, and tiny slivers of glass glittered throughout her blonde hair as she continued to sob and scream. "They shot Ken. They shot Ken. They didn't have to do that." Really, Trina? Like, where have you been? It's just, again, astounding. A townswoman walked directly in front of Trina and said to her face, "Yes, they did. You didn't leave us any choice." Ken Herner, the bank manager, noticed that in addition to the blood and whatnot on Trina, she also had a wet stain on the crotch of her jeans, and a puddle had formed on the floor under her chair. It's not uncommon when people are terrified for bodily functions to go on without permission. The cashiers, both women who Trina knew, came over to try to take her into the bathroom to clean up. But Trina, after hearing Jack tell them to take care of her, she fought them. She thought they were going to take her into the back and kill her too. I can't say I blame her on that, but, you know. So Herner called Tim, Ken's brother, and told him that Ken had been in an accident and that they had Trina and he better come get her. About 5 minutes later, Tim drove up the hill and slowed only slightly as he passed the silent Silverado. Tim came in, retrieved Trina, and attempted to go check on Ken, but Trina sobbed that he was dead and to just please take her home. The call about the killing had come into the sheriff's office around 11 a.m., which was about 45 minutes after Ken had been shot. The sheriff and Deputy Sheriff Danny Estes and Jim Kish jumped into their cruiser and took off to Skidmore, lights flashing and sirens blaring. Ken was still slumped alone in his truck on Main Street. The aftermath of the shooting was a mixed bag, right? The people had felt that there'd been no other options, but the murder seemed to haunt the people of Skidmore years afterward. Trina gave the names of the men she believed had killed Ken. His autopsy showed that he had been hit by 2 different guns, a .30-30 slug and a .22. A .22 is a small caliber weapon, sometimes referred to as like a plinking gun, due to it having no real kickback. It can be used for hunting, but really only on smaller game like squirrels or rabbits. Shooting cans is what it's used for a lot of the time. However, it was indeed this smaller bullet that was the fatal shot for Ken Rex McElroy. It had entered his skull and bounced around inside, causing, as you can imagine, all kinds of damage. Stratton had gone directly to Skidmore when he had heard, just to see for himself. He felt a sense of failure. Like the town had begged the justice system for help more than once, which they had, and it had repeatedly failed them. they'd had to take the matter into their own hands. After consulting with the investigators on scene, who declared confidently that they'd soon find the killer, the only cop that Ken Rex McElroy had ever feared drove away from his murder scene. Trina was inconsolable, and she actually ended up filing a lawsuit against the town of Skidmore for the unlawful killing. But no matter how many people were interviewed or how many times they interviewed them, Trina was the only one to ever name any names. Every citizen who had been present insisted they hadn't seen who the gunman had been. They had all dropped as soon as the bullets started flying. Life slowly went back to what could be considered normal in Skidmore. People walked the streets more confidently, and though the investigation continued, no one was ever brought to justice in the killing. It seemed that the townfolk had learned at least one lesson from Ken Rex. No witness, no case. A coroner's jury was convened, and despite Trina testifying and naming Del Clement as one of the shooters, the jury returned with their verdict after only 47 minutes. That Ken Rex McElroy had died from a felony committed by a person or persons unknown. And I imagine that 45 of those minutes were them debating on whether it was too soon for them to go back out and give their verdict. Whether they needed to wait a little bit longer so that it didn't seem hurried, rushed. I don't know. Soon after the killing, the McElroys all packed up and left Skidmore, scared of retribution or continuing vigilante justice, and not long after they'd left, someone burned the McElroy farmhouse to the ground. Trina went on a media tour, denying all of the terrible things that Ken had been accused of and, let's face it, been found guilty of and everyone knew he'd done, praising him as an amazing father and husband, and insisting he wasn't a thief, but rather a part-time farmer and antique seller. Skidmore ended up settling Trina's $5 million lawsuit for $17,600, and this was the only legal action that ever officially was taken in the murder of Ken Rex McElroy. Trina eventually came out of her Stockholm Syndrome, which I think we can all agree it was, and remarried, and distanced herself from Skidmore and the McElroys, both physically and emotionally. She remarried, but sadly, she passed away on July 24th, 2012, at age 55. I think we can all agree that Trina had a tragic life, and there was no one really on her side to help her, but that doesn't excuse her behavior. We explain, but we don't excuse. The only official suspect in the shooting, Del Clement, passed away on January 9th, 2009, of sclerosis of the liver. Now, this is a long, drawn-out disease that would usually give the sufferer time to settle their affairs and get right with whatever power they believe might be waiting to meet them on the other side of this life, but there was no deathbed confession. Skidmore, Missouri suffered the consequences of Ken McElroy's reign of terror long after he was interred. It seemed like the specter of the unsolved shooting haunted the small town. It was never a bustling metropolis, but ever since Ken was gunned down outside the pool hall, the population of Skidmore has continued to drop, standing at only 189 in 2019. It more closely resembles a ghost town these days. And that's the story of Ken Rex McElroy and Skidmore, Missouri, a town that took justice into their own hands. Thank you so much for joining me for this fourth and final part of the Ken Rex McElroy series. I'm planning to continue this channel as a true crime channel, and I will do my darndest not to disappear like that for so long again. Life is gonna kill me. Like, it really is. It's guilty of attempted murder. Oh my gosh, it was so bad. Maybe one day I will tell a story time of what happened, but it was the worst. It was so bad. Anyway, I'm back. So don't forget to give me a like so that I can have external validation because I am insecure. And if you haven't subscribed yet, but why though? We have fun over here. I mean, when I show up, which I'm planning to do more. That's it for me, guys. I'll be back with another case as soon as I can. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Give me a comment. Join the family we're building here, talking about horrible things. And I'll see you next time. Anissa out.